In Melbourne, I should say, Liberal Senator James Paterson from Adelaide, Greens Senator Sarah Hanson-Young. Thank you both for your time, being very patient through this hour. Let's start on religious discrimination. The latest draft has been released. James Paterson, do you have any issues?
It's been a really good process, Tom. I think the bill that the Attorney General released yesterday, although I'm not across every bit of the detail yet, is a better bill than the one that we released a few months ago. And it's taken on board feedback from religious communities, from employers, from LGBTI advocates, and I think has arrived at a better place, cleared up some issues that were causing confusion and uncertainty and clarified those. And I think this final period of consultation before the government introduces a bill in the new year will be the opportunity to iron out any remaining issues. But from what I see so far, I think it looks really good.
I'm going to take a guess here that you don't entirely agree, Sarah Hanson-Young.
I don't know what newspapers or comments Senator Paterson's been reading, but not the same ones that I have. I mean, I think this whole debate has become an absolute cluster mess for the government. This iteration of the bill is in no way superior. It's a total mess, and in fact, I think it's creating even more questions than answers. We've got now a situation where as a woman who might need to access the morning after pill, maybe she lives in a small country town, if the pharmacist decides that he doesn't want to give it to people, i.e. women, then she won't be able to access it. I mean, that's how broad this bill would create this type of discrimination. Look, I think it's off. I think if once Australians work out this is what the government has in plan and store for them, there's going to be outrage, just as there is, of course, from St Vincent's de Paul today. The one organisation that the government cited as being winners out of this piece of legislation have come out fuming today. They're livid at the suggestion. They say they never supported this. They didn't put in a submission. They don't want it. And in fact, they're worried about the impact that this is going to have on vulnerable people getting access to services.
What do you make of that example, that first one, James? Perhaps it's a 1 or 2 chemist town and they're refusing the morning after pill and somebody has to leave their town to get it. Would that happen, and is that acceptable?
Well, Tom, the government has in fact in this draft narrowed the conscientious objection provisions that were in the first draft by removing some professions and making clear that it would not be lawful to refuse service to someone on the basis of who they are. You would only be able to refuse services offering a range of services that you have a religious objection to.
But would that stop that happening?
Only women need the morning after pill.
Just to finish the point there Tom, this is based on the advice of the Australian Medical Association, who've accepted recommendations they have made and narrowed the conscientious objection. But on the St Vincent de Paul Society point, this is a really important one too. Vinnies can say publicly what they like, that's up to them, but there is a case in law from Queensland involving St Vincent de Paul Society that a range of groups has asked us to fix. St Vinnies in Queensland advertised for a CEO and asked that it be a Catholic person because it's a Catholic charity, and I think that's reasonable. I think a Catholic organisation should be able to stipulate that their CEO be Catholic. The law in Queensland prevented them from doing that. That's a ridiculous situation, and the law will clear that up.
All right.
I really think that once women in particular understand that this is what the government has in store for them, all hell is going to break loose. Now, originally, people were worried that this was going to be just a broad brush attack on LGBTI Australians, and if that wasn't bad enough, now what we're seeing exposed in this piece of legislation is just how vulnerable half the population are going to be.
I just wanted to follow up with you, James, on the example of the pharmacies in a small country town. The situation outlined, that could happen under this legislation, couldn't it?
I don't think that's right, Tom. My understanding is that the federal conscientious objection provisions don't override any existing state law. That is, in the case where a state already has a law in this area, it will prevail. So whatever the status quo there is won't change.
What if it doesn't? Do all the states have a law that overruled that?
I'm not sure in every single state, Tom, but effectively what this law is trying to do is be a belt and braces situation. And it starts from the principle that it is not a good thing in this country, in a free, pluralistic society, to force people to act against their conscience, against their genuinely held religious beliefs. We shouldn't compel them to do something that is against their religious beliefs, and I think that is a good, sound principle.
It's also someone, though, as a health professional, right, providing a service subsidised by the taxpayer. They're working for the taxpayer in a way.
Well, Tom, we've got to be really careful about how we define that. I mean, effectively, if that's your rule, then a massive chunk of Australians and a massive chunk of the economy would lose their rights to their religious liberty or their freedom of association or their freedom of speech if they work in anything that's publicly funded. So that could be a school or a hospital or an aged care home or a pharmacy or indeed the public service. That would be a big, big chunk of Australia. I don't think they immediately surrender their rights to religious liberty just because they're employed by the taxpayer.
I did just want to move on to one other topic because we are short on time. The UK election, this one caught my eye about the Corbyn manifesto, Sarah Hanson-Young. He wants to nationalise a whole host of assets, have free university and ban private schools. Any ideas that appeal to you?
Well, we of course took election policy to a policy to the election for making universities and TAFE free, because we know we've got to give our young people and our older people the opportunity to get access to education and training, particularly in the changing way work is. We know that the jobs of the future are going to require retraining, so that's something, of course, that I guess if you're living in the UK would be quite something that would actually work for young people. Tom, I hope we actually, I really do want to say something about climate change, and I guess thinking about the context of internationally, I cannot believe that we have the country on fire right now, Sydney smothered in smoke, people choking because it is so hazardous, and our our federal minister, is overseas trying to rot the planet. I mean, the difference between the leadership shown today by Matt Keane in New South Wales as the Environment Minister there in that state versus the lack of leadership we've got from the federal government and Angus Taylor is stark. The Liberal Party better start getting their house in order before they lose votes in their own camp.
I'm going to jump in because we are nearly out of time, but I'll give James Paterson a response to that. We do have Angus Taylor essentially going overseas and arguing for Australia to be able to emit more than if the Kyoto carryovers did not apply. That's just a mathematical fact, isn't it?
Just very briefly, Tom, on Jeremy Corbyn, I never thought I'd say this, but Jeremy Corbyn makes Sarah and her Greens colleagues look like moderates. They're not proposing anything as radical as he is, so that's a welcome thing for Australian politics. On the carryover credits, Tom, even I am old enough to remember when the Howard government was criticised for not signing up to the Kyoto Protocol, and now we're being criticised for upholding the principles of the Kyoto Protocol, which allowed for carryover credits, which is a perfectly legitimate tool, which ensures that
it was never agreed
still
to take them all the way to 2030. That hasn't been an agreement. That's what's being debated now.
And on that merits issue, I think it's an absolutely legitimate tool because countries still have to achieve their stated emissions reduction targets. If you promise to reduce your emissions by a certain amount by a certain date, carryover credits don't change the amount that you have to reduce it by. It just takes into account if in your earlier years you overachieve and your later years you underachieve.
Well, except the
you still
overachievement,
get
if
to
you
the
go
same
right
point.
back, we still have carryovers from the original agreement where we were allowed to increase emissions by 8% while others were reducing. So the overachievement isn't really overachievement in that context.
Well, Australia was far from alone in being allowed to increase emissions in earlier periods. In fact, as you know, Tom, many nations, the largest emitter in the world, included China, is allowed to increase emissions out to 2030 under the Paris Agreement. So there's nothing unusual about that.
All right.
And our cumulative emissions reduction task does not change because of carryover credits.
Okay. I'm going to have to leave it there. I'm sorry to cut things short, Sarah and James, but well and truly out of time. We'll perhaps speak soon. If not, do enjoy your Christmas break. We're going to take a break on the program.